Hot blood hit my cheek. A split second later, the guard's dead weight slammed into the polished marble. For 3 months, the Alpha King had treated me like a total ghost. I was just a dirty street rat he had been blackmailed into claiming. A political problem he preferred to ignore. Then that mercenary stepped out of line. He spat directly at my boots. The king didn't just break his 3 months of silence. He stepped down from his throne. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't issue a single royal command. He simply tore the man's throat out with his bare hands. Steel ripped through the air, burying itself into the timber beside Runa's head. Wood splintered. Above her, the tavern tore itself apart in a riot of screaming patrons and breaking glass. The sharp stench of spilled ale mixed with sour sweat. Runa slid under an overturned oak table. Dust coated her tongue. She closed her eyes for a single second, forcing her jagged breathing to slow. 3 days without sleep. Her reflexes were wearing down. A heavy boot kicked the table away. The tracker stood over her, scarred jaw, flat, dead expression. They never stopped hunting. She didn't think. Rolling across the sticky floorboards, her fingers caught the shattered remains of a clay mug. With a sharp, upward thrust, she drove the jagged ceramic straight into the back of his knee. Tendons popped. The man went down hard, clutching his leg. Runa kicked his remaining foot out from under him. His skull hit the planks with a wet crack. Silence settled over their corner of the bar. Runa pushed herself backward through the dirt. Kaelin was still tied up by the hearth. The highest value traitor in the kingdom, and her only way out of the mud. She grabbed his leather collar. "Get up." Dragging his dead weight through the back door into the alley sent fire tearing through her shoulder. Icy rain hit her face. She tasted copper from a split lip. A sudden flash of memory hit her. A damp cellar. Men tearing her childhood home apart. She pressed her back against the brick wall, letting the cold rain soak her skin. The alley was quiet except for the downpour. She took a slow breath. Never again. Wiping the blood from her chin, she looked back at the tavern doors. Shouting bled through the wood. More boots, more trackers. Her pulse hammered. Her hand dropped to the silver-edged hilt strapped to her thigh. Kaelin groaned, his head rolling to the side. The royal crest stood out, branded dark into his neck. Selling him to the guild meant gold. But gold just bought another dirty tavern and another week of running. She looked at the bleeding traitor. She didn't need coin. She needed ironclad immunity. "Change of plans," Runa muttered, hauling him to his feet. Her ribs ached in protest. She was taking him to the citadel, straight to the apex sovereign. Pressing the blade to Kaelin's throat, she shoved him forward, into the storm.
The throne room felt like a tomb. White marble, absolute suffocating cold. Valen sat motionless on the high seat, a heavy pale fur draped across his shoulders. He watched the Lord begging on the floor below. The man's weeping echoed off the high walls, a pathetic, grating sound. A spike of pain hit behind Valen's eyes. Deep in his chest, something feral scratched at the edges of his control. It wanted to drop from the dais. It wanted to silence the noise permanently. He swallowed the metallic taste of adrenaline. 10 years ago, he let that instinct loose. The memory of burning ash still haunted him. Valen raised one leather-gloved hand. The Lord choked off his sob instantly. "You took from the winter harvest?" Valen's voice carried no inflection. 3 families froze. You forfeit your lands. "Please, my king." The man scrambled forward. Valen flicked 2 fingers toward the guards. "Remove him." Silver-clad soldiers seized the man's arms, and they dragged him backward across the polished stone. The heavy iron doors slammed shut, rattling the frosted glass in the windows. Quiet returned to the hall. Valen closed his eyes and let out a long breath. The air smelled of lemon oil and cold stone. Sterile. Then a draft slipped under the iron doors. Valen opened his eyes. The scent hit the back of his throat. Rain, hot rust, blood. Beneath the copper tang was something else. A sharp, spiced undercurrent that made his teeth ache. A low vibration started in his chest. He gripped the carved armrests. The solid wood splintered under his hands. The spy master stepped from the shadow of a pillar. The old man gave a shaky bow. "My king, there is a disturbance at the main gates." "Explain." "It is the traitor, Kalen. He has been found." Valen leaned forward. "Bring the tracking team here." "It is not a team." The spy master kept his eyes on the floor. "A single bounty hunter. A rogue. She demands an audience and refuses to hand him over to anyone else." Valen stood. The heavy furs swept against the marble. A stray rogue issuing demands at his gates. Let her in. He would strip the arrogance from her the second she walked through those doors.
The iron doors groaned, opening to a blast of freezing air. Runa stepped onto the white marble. The chill cut right through her soaked leather jacket. Mud dripped from her boots, staining the pristine stone. She hauled Kalen forward, his limp boots dragged behind him, leaving a thick, wet ribbon of red across the holy floor of the citadel. Guards lined the walls. A dozen longswords slid from their scabbards, ringing out in sharp harmony. Runa kept walking. Water squelched in her boots with every step. King Valen waited on the throne at the far end of the hall. He was massive, draped in heavy furs, sitting with the utter stillness of a predator. He looked less like a man and more like something carved from the frozen tundra. 10 feet from the dais, Runa let go. Kalen hit the floor with a heavy thud. Runa planted her muddy boot on his chest and dragged her silver blade across his windpipe. The guards rushed her. A wall of moving steel. Hold. The single command cracked like a whip. It vibrated through the floorboards, settling heavy in Runa's stomach. She looked up, pale gold eyes locked onto hers. The gaze was absolute ice, backed by a wild, crushing pressure. Her lungs seized. The instinct to drop to her knees hit her so hard she had to bite the inside of her cheek. The metallic taste of blood grounded her. She forced her spine straight. "You want him." Her raspy voice echoed in the cavernous room. "I know what he did to the borders. I know what he stole." Valen stood, towering above her, on the dais. "You have done the crown a service. The treasurer will pay you. Leave the body." Runa pressed the blade down. A bright bead of blood welled against Kalen's skin. "Keep your gold. It doesn't stop arrows in the dark." Valen tilted his head. He looked over her soaked hair, her bruised jaw, the ruined armor. "Then what do you demand?" Runa swallowed hard. There was no going back now. Contract." Total silence fell over the hall. The guards watched, waiting for the order to cut her down. Valen didn't blink. "You demand direct protection, the privileges of the court." She lifted her chin. She stared straight into the dead center of his freezing glare. "I demand a mating contract." She kept her voice dead steady. "Claim me on paper. You get your traitor, and I finally get to sleep." Under the crushing weight of his stare, Runa braced her boots against the slick marble. For the first time in a decade, the king of the north hesitated. He didn't signal the guards. Instead, his gaze dropped to her bruised mouth. The freezing composure cracked, giving way to something violently hot. He stepped off the dais.
The sheer audacity of the woman made Valen's blood run hot. He was the law. He was the absolute ruler of this realm. Yet here, on his pristine marble floor, a bruised street rat was holding his kingdom hostage. Valin kept his eyes locked on the silver blade, pressing into the traitor's throat. A dead Kaelin offered nothing to his crumbling borders. He needed the information locked inside that skull, which meant he had to play her game. Silence stretched across the throne room, and the royal counselors drew collective, horrified breaths. Valin raised a single hand. The gasps stopped. He stepped off the dais, his boots ringing sharp against the stone. With every step, the scent hit him again. Wild rain, fresh blood. "You demand a blood oath." His voice was low, scraping against his throat. "You bind yourself to a monster just to outrun gutter assassins." "I'll take my chances with the monster." Her whisper was dead steady. She didn't flinch as he stopped in front of her. He reached out. His leather glove wrapped around her calloused fingers. Her skin was freezing. Then, a sudden jolt of heat shot up his forearm. Deep in his mind, the wolf slammed against its cage. 10 years of discipline buckled. Valin drew the ceremonial dagger from his belt. He didn't break eye contact as he sliced the meat of his own palm. He took her hand and dragged the bloodied steel across her skin. By the old laws. He pressed his bleeding hand against hers. "I claim you." Magic surged, thick and heavy in the air. The metallic taste of her blood coated the back of Valen's throat. It was raw power, laced with dark honey. His pupils dilated. A forgotten prophecy echoed in his mind, a warning about a fractured mate. He shoved the thought down. A deafening roar ripped through his skull. Mine. Valin tore his hand away. He stepped back, his chest heaving. Panic clawed at his throat. He had to put distance between them before his control shattered completely. To drag the traitor to the dungeons. His voice held a slight, betraying tremor. "Lock my bride in the east wing." He turned his back on her, desperate to hide the feral gold bleeding into his eyes.
The heavy lock clicked. It sounded exactly like a coffin lid, snapping shut. Runa stood, frozen in the center of the massive bedroom. Red velvet curtains trapped the heat from the fireplaces. Silk pillows covered the wide mattress. It was a lavish cage. She hated the quiet. Silence just meant you couldn't hear the blade sliding from its sheath. Her pulse hammered against her ribs. Did the king have any idea how deeply the assassins had infiltrated his city? Exhaustion pulled at her limbs, but instinct won out. She bypassed the bed. She checked the latches on the tall windows. She ran her fingers over the metal grating of the air vents. She knelt to inspect the narrow gap beneath the heavy oak door. A phantom scent filled her nose. Burning poison. A cold night at the smiling Jackal Inn. 3 men pouring toxins under her door to finish a broken rib. She swallowed dryly. Never trust a locked room. The royal guards had taken her silver knife. She was unarmed. Runa dragged a heavy mahogany chair under the glowing crystal chandelier. She climbed up, her boots scuffing the upholstery. Reaching high, she gripped a long, jagged crystal tear and twisted. The glass snapped free. The edge was sharp enough to slice muscle. She dropped to the floor and crawled straight under the king-sized bed. The polished wood was hard and freezing against her spine. She pressed her back flat against the wall, clutching the crystal shard to her chest. Her fingers trembled. A draft slipped through the window seals. The velvet bedskirt stirred. Outside the glass, a tall shadow detached from the royal hedges. Moonlight caught a glint of metal, a silver gilt token held loosely in a gloved hand. Runa's breath hitched. They were already inside the walls. She squeezed the crystal shard until it cut into her palm. She focused on the pain, entirely unaware that glowing eyes were watching her every move from the dark.
The silver scrying mirror showed him exactly what he didn't want to see. Valin stood rigid in his unlit study. He had activated the glass, expecting to find an enemy's weakness. He thought he'd see a greedy thief lounging in his silk sheets, gloating over her new royal status. He found a broken soldier instead. He watched in stunned silence as the tiny woman dismantled his chandelier. He watched her crawl into the dark beneath the bed frame, curling up like a beaten stray. Oh, the logical monarch dissolved. A deep ache settled low in his chest. She wasn't a parasite. She was a survivor waiting for the final blow. He closed his eyes. The smell of charred timber flared in his memory. Screams echoed. 10 years ago, he lost control, and innocence paid the price. He had sworn that no one would ever cower in fear on his lands again. Now, his blood-bound mate was shaking on his floorboards. "Why are you so afraid?" His whisper barely disturbed the quiet of the study. The wolf pressed against his mind. This time, it didn't demand destruction. It demanded to hunt. It wanted the shadows that made her bleed. A flicker of movement in the mirror caught his eye. A dark silhouette shifted against the reflection of her window. Someone was hunting what belonged to him. A low snarl ripped from Valen's chest. His fingernails elongated, digging deep, ragged grooves into the polished wood of his desk. The political games were over. To keep her safe, he was going to have to unleash the exact monster she was hiding from.
The long dining table was a polished oak battlefield. Runa sat rigid in her chair. The roasted duck on her silver plate smelled rich, but her stomach turned at the sight of it. She was still wearing her scuffed black leathers. The court ladies had tried to force her into a silk gown an hour ago. She had threatened to break the dresser's fingers. Now, silver buckles clinked sharply against fine crystal as she reached for her goblet. The royal court watched her. Young women whispered behind feathered fans. Men with soft hands and cold eyes stared down their noses. They hated her. She had tracked the mud of the streets onto their clean, holy floors. A memory flashed behind her eyes, a merchant in the outlands. He had worn fine red velvet, just like these lords. He promised her a hot meal and sold her to a slaver ring the next morning. Fancy clothes just hid dirtier lies. Does the little stray dog know which fork to use? Lord Vance leaned across the table. Sure, his voice was pitched loud enough for the entire room to hear. Or do you eat with your paws like a wild animal? Runa didn't blink. Her hand shot out. Her fingers closed around a heavy, serrated steak knife. She threw it. The steel crossed the table in a blur. It buried itself deep into the mahogany, exactly 1 inch from Vance's pale, trembling fingers. I eat the people who talk too much. Runa leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. Yeah, you sit in this safe little castle and think titles make you bulletproof. Down in the mud, you wouldn't last 5 minutes. She tilted her head. Push me, little lord, and you lose a hand. The room went dead silent. Someone dropped a spoon. At the head of the table, Valen sat perfectly still. He didn't look angry. His golden eyes tracked her every movement, gleaming with a quiet, dangerous amusement. A servant approached Runa's chair, his hands shaking as he poured dark red wine into her goblet. Runa lifted the heavy cup. The smell of fermented grapes hit her first. A second later, the bitter, sharp scent of crushed nightshade burned the back of her throat. She froze. Someone had smuggled poison into the king's private kitchen. Runa slammed the goblet onto the marble floor. Dark wine splashed across the stone. The crystal shattered into a dozen jagged pieces. She kicked her heavy wooden chair back and stood up. Her hand dropped to her empty thigh holster. It was time to show this fragile court exactly how the streets worked.
The crunch of breaking bone echoed across the courtyard. Valen gripped the marble railing of the balcony. Below him, in the dusty training ring, his bride was tearing his elite guards apart. He had ordered her to spar to burn off her restless energy. He assumed his disciplined soldiers would disarm her quickly. He was wrong. She fought dirty. She fought fast. She fought like a cornered animal with nothing to lose. Deep in his chest, the wolf roared in approval. Every time she dodged a heavy broadsword, every time she swept a massive soldier into the dirt, Valen's pulse hammered. He remembered his own training. His father had beaten him until he fought with perfect, emotionless form. Raw anger was supposed to be a weakness, a fatal flaw. Watching Runa spin and strike in the heat, he realized anger could be beautifully lethal. "She is going to kill Captain Thorne," the spy master muttered, standing a few feet away. He wiped sweat from his forehead. "And she fights like a demon. We should stop this before a good soldier dies." "No." Valen kept his eyes on the dust and blood below. "She is playing with him. Sire, watch her footwork. She is testing his blind spots. She is memorizing our defense tactics." Valen's grip on the railing tightened. "She is brilliant." Runa dropped low, driving a heavy kick squarely into the captain's chest. He hit the hard dirt with a breathless thud. She stood over him, her chest heaving. Sweat and dust coated her skin. She slowly wiped a streak of blood from her split lip, then tilted her chin up. Her fierce eyes locked directly onto Valen's across the wide courtyard. The challenge hung thick in the air between them. She wasn't just fighting his guards. She was testing his control. A low snarl vibrated in Valen's chest. The real battle hadn't even started yet.
The ancient map book exploded into a cloud of shredded paper. A shadow dropped from the high ceiling. A curved blade slashed the empty air exactly where Runa's throat had been a second before. She rolled across the polished wood. The library smelled of old ink and sudden, sharp dust. A masked assassin stood between her and the heavy oak door. How did a killer get past the Citadel's wards? She pulled her fists up. Survive first. Figure out the puzzle later. The assassin lunged. Runa dodged left, violently kicking a heavy reading cart into his path. The man stumbled over the wooden wheels. The fight broke out in the narrow aisles between the towering bookshelves. It was brutal and perfectly silent. He punched her jaw. She slammed his head into a shelf. He stepped back and slashed his dagger upward. The silver blade caught her unprotected side. White-hot fire tore across her ribs. She gasped, stumbling backward. A memory flashed, bleeding out in a frozen ditch 3 winters ago, and nobody came. Waiting for the king's slow guards was a waste of breath. The pain made her vision swim. She grabbed a solid bronze statue from a nearby desk. With everything she had left, she smashed it directly into the assassin's temple. He dropped to the floor. Dead weight. Silence rushed back into the library, broken only by her ragged breathing. Runa leaned heavily against a bookshelf. She pressed her hand to her side. Hot, sticky blood was already soaking through her shirt. She didn't call for help. She dragged herself out of the library and back to her velvet prison in the East Wing. Sitting on the edge of the lavish bed, she dug a needle and thick thread from her boot pouch. She bit down hard on a leather strap. She pushed the steel straight through her torn flesh, pulling the wound closed. She kicked the bloody rags under the loose floorboards. She was safe for the night. But she was entirely unaware that the King of the North could track the scent of fresh blood from a mile away.
Copper and rotting herbs. The scent drifted down the pristine marble corridor, snagging in the back of Valen's throat. He stopped moving. The heavy oak doors to the east wing were locked tight. He gripped the edge of a decorative table. The silver vase dented under his fingers. Blood. Sickness. Someone was bleeding inside his walls. He didn't knock. He drove his fist straight into the thick oak. The lock gave way with a splintering crack. Wood rained onto the stone as the door slammed open. Runa whipped around from the hearth. Her face was entirely drained of color. She dragged a velvet blanket against her chest. The room smelled like burning sage and fresh gore. He looked at the red staining her knuckles. What happened? She took a step back. Nothing. Get out. Valen crossed the room in 3 strides. Catching her shoulders, he yanked the heavy velvet away and let it drop to the floorboards. A crude, soaked bandage wrapped her lower ribs. A jagged black thread cut into inflamed skin. You hit a wound inside my walls. His jaw locked. Who? She shoved at his solid chest. I handled it. Someone got into your holy library, and I gutted him. I don't need your guards. Valen stared down at her. 10 years of perfect security shattered. The room went dead quiet, save for the crackle of the hearth. Pack your steel. He dropped his hands from her shoulders. We ride for the northern fortress tonight. I'm tearing this citadel down to the foundation to find the rat who let them in. She planted her boots into the rug. I'm not your prisoner. He leaned down until he was inches from her face. You are mine. I'll lock you in a cage of solid iron before I let you bleed out on my floors.
The carriage slammed over a deep rut in the flooded road. Runa gripped the edge of the velvet bench. White-hot pain flared along her stitched ribs. Outside, a mountain storm tore through the pines. Freezing rain lashed the glass. Valen sat across from her, completely still. He hadn't spoken a word since the citadel. A muscle jumped in his jaw. Then the door blew off its hinges, wood splintered. The heavy carriage flipped. Runa slammed into the ceiling, biting her tongue hard enough to taste copper. Outside, horses shrieked. She dragged herself out of the wreckage. Freezing mud instantly soaked her leathers. She crouched behind a broken wheel. 20 masked men formed a ring around the debris. Rain dripped from their drawn steel. The royal guards were already dead in the dirt. A sniper stepped from the tree line. He raised a heavy crossbow. The serrated bolt tip glowed with a sickly green poison. He wasn't aiming at her. The sights were locked on Valen's back. Valen was wrenching his broadsword out of a dead man's chest, completely exposed. They're executing the crown. Runa's pulse hammered in her ears. She survived by running. She survived by putting herself first. The crossbow snapped loudly over the thunder. The green bolt cut through the rain. Runa launched herself forward. She slammed into Valen's back, driving them both into the freezing mud. Steel punched through her right shoulder. She choked on a gasp. The bolt buried itself deep into her muscle. Dark spots flooded her vision. She slumped against Valen's chest. His hands caught her. His pupils swallowed the gold in his eyes. Runa. She dug her fingers into his soaked shirt. Fire raced through her veins. Told you. Blood bubbled hot and wet on her lips. I handle my own problems. Her eyes slid shut. Above her, a deafening howl tore the storm wide open.
Valen knelt in the mud. He held her limp body against his chest. Toxic green veins were already webbing up her pale neck. She had taken the steel meant for his spine. He laid her gently in the dirt. He stood up and faced the 20 drawn blades. He unclasped his heavy fur cloak. It hit the mud with a wet slap. His bones broke. They snapped and reformed with deafening cracks. The beast he had buried for a decade tore its way out. His fingers stretched into talons. His jaw unhinged, or he didn't bother picking up his sword. He launched himself at the line of assassins. It was a slaughter. He tore through boiled leather and chainmail like wet paper. Hot blood sprayed across the freezing rain. He crushed throats and shattered ribs. Men screamed, slipping in the mud as they tried to run. He didn't stop until nothing was moving. The heavy, wet sound of the storm returned. Valen stood among the dead. He dropped back onto two legs, coated in gore. He fell to his knees beside Runa. Her skin was freezing. "No." He scooped her up. "You don't die on me." He carried her into the pines. An abandoned hunting cabin sat in a clearing. He kicked the rotting door open and laid her across a dusty table. He ripped the soaked linen away from her shoulder. The flesh around the bolt was rotting. He drew his dagger and sliced his own palm open. He pressed his bleeding hand directly over her wound, pushing his magic into her, forcing his blood to burn the poison out. Runa screamed. Her back arched violently off the wood. Valen pinned her down. He pressed his forehead to her burning skin. "I've got you. Fight it." Her eyes cracked open. She glared up at him through the pain. Her jaw tightened. "Just protecting your investment." The last wire in Valen's head snapped. He slammed his bloody hands onto the table beside her head. He leaned down, crushing the space between them. His mouth came down on hers. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. Tasting of rain, copper, and adrenaline. He caught her jaw with his thumb, demanding her breath, needing to feel that she was alive.
The cabin was freezing. Frost coated the inside of the windows. Runa lay flat on the splintered oak table, staring at the ceiling. She reached up to touch her right shoulder. The green rot was gone. Smooth skin met her fingertips, where Valen's blood had burned the poison out. She closed her eyes, the heavy weight of his mouth still pressed against her memory. Feral gold, desperation. He had kissed her like a dying man finding water. It terrified her. Did he actually want her? Or did the monster inside him just need a broken thing to claim? Her chest tightened. A memory dragged itself to the surface. A freezing night in the slums. A smiling mentor who offered a hot fire, then sold her to the fighting pits before morning. Shelter was just a steel trap, painted gold. Runa slid off the table. Her bare feet hit the floorboards. Valen was asleep against the far wall. His chest rose and fell in a slow, heavy rhythm. She didn't wake him. She pulled her dagger from its sheath and slipped out the door into the mist. Pine needles scratched her bare calves. Mud sucked at her heels. The icy air burned her throat. She ran. She needed distance from the cabin, from the kiss, from the fact that watching him take a blade would break her. She slowed her pace, leaning against a damp pine trunk to catch her breath. The quiet of the woods pressed in. Then a detail clicked in her mind. The assassin's crossbow. Right before she took the bolt, she had seen the royal crest carved into the wood. Why would a street killer be carrying citadel armory? She shoved the thought away and pushed off the tree. Snap! A heavy branch broke in the brush behind her. Runa froze. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She gripped the hilt of her dagger. Someone was tracking her. A guild assassin, finishing the job, or the king she had just walked away from. Heavy boots crushed the dead leaves. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. She backed up until her shoulders hit a wall of cold, jagged rock. The shadow stepped through the mist.
The morning mist couldn't hide the scent of her panic. Valen tore through a wall of dead pine branches. His chest heaved. He had woken up to a cold room and an empty table. The wolf scratched at the inside of his ribs. It wanted to hunt. A dark memory surfaced. A young guard dragged into these same woods years ago, screaming until his throat gave out. Valen had sworn no one under his protection would ever bleed in the dark again. Yet here he was, tracking the woman tied to his soul as she sprinted toward a cliff. He followed her bare footprints through the mud. The sound of white water rapids grew deafening, crashing against black stones 100 feet below. Valen stepped out of the tree line. He was unarmed. His hands hung empty at his sides. Runa spun around at the edge of the drop. Her knuckles were white around the hilt of her dagger. She pointed the steel directly at his chest. "Stay back." Valen stopped. He didn't issue an order. He slowly raised his palms, then tilted his head back, baring his throat to her blade. "If you jump, I go into the river after you." He pitched his voice to cut through the roar of the water. "If you run, I tear the ground apart to find you. We share a blood oath. I don't survive a single sunrise without you." Runa's hand shook violently. Tears cut clean lines through the dirt on her face. "I bring death to everything I touch. Oh, the guild will burn your entire citadel to the ground just to get to me." Valen took one heavy step forward. "Let them try." He kept his eyes locked on hers. "I will drown them in the dirt before a blade touches you. Stop running. Choose me." Her fingers went slack. The silver dagger dropped, clattering against the rocks. Valen closed the distance. He pulled her hard against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed in the scent of pine and rain, his arms locking around her like a steel vault.
The massive iron gates of the citadel groaned shut, cutting off the mountain storm. Runa walked down the pristine marble corridor. Valen's hand was wrapped tightly around hers. Her shoulder ached, a dull throb from the poison, but the quiet of the halls didn't feel like a trap anymore. She finally had a wall at her back. Heavy boots pounded on the stone behind them. A messenger boy sprinted down the hall. He collapsed to his knees, gasping. He smelled like ash and burning pitch. "Sire," he coughed, leaving soot on the marble. "The Outland Market. It's gone." A faint draft pulled through the high windows. Runa smelled it then, distant smoke. Her stomach dropped. Valen squeezed her hand. "Explain." "The guild firebombed the lower square." The boy wiped his face. "They trapped the families inside the tavern. They painted a message in blood on the outer wall. They said they'll burn the rest of the lower city by midnight if you don't surrender the hunter." The floor seemed to tilt. Innocent people were burning. An image flashed in her mind. A starving street kid who used to trade her stolen apples for silver. Was he caught in the fire? How much blood was she willing to spill just to have a safe place to sleep? Then the puzzle pieces snapped together. How did the guild know exactly where to strike to hurt her? The royal crest on the sniper's crossbow, if the poisoned wine at the private dinner, this pinpoint attack on her old market. The enemy wasn't just in the mud. They were sitting at the king's council table. Valen looked down at her. His muscles were corded, braced for her to pull away. He expected her to run again. He expected her to offer herself to the guild to save his city. Runa let go of his hand. She rolled her shoulders back and looked up into his eyes. The guilt evaporated, replaced by cold, absolute iron. She reached down to her thigh holster and unlatched her throwing knife. The silver flashed in the dim light. "We don't negotiate with rats." She gripped the leather handle. "We exterminate them."
The war room smelled like sour sweat and panic. Valen slammed his fists onto the oak table. The map of the Outlands rattled. He had just demanded his general's march. He had just declared total war. 10 lords of the council sat rigid in their chairs. No one moved to issue the order. Lord Vance pushed himself up from the table. He gripped a thick roll of parchment, his pale hands shaking. "The army remains here, sire." The room went completely silent. Valen's eyes narrowed. "You defy your king." Vance unrolled the heavy paper. "By ancient blood law, a monarch cannot mobilize the royal army for a personal vendetta without a majority council vote." The lord's lip curled into a trembling sneer. "You aren't protecting our borders. You're risking the citadel for a street whore. Hand the bounty hunter to the guild, and the fires in the outlands stopped tonight. A cold, familiar anger settled in Valin's chest. He remembered his grandfather, and locked in a stone tower by a greedy council while rogue wolves burned the villages. These soft men cared only for their gold. They would let the kingdom burn to keep their coin purses heavy. Around the table, the scrape of steel echoed off the stone walls. 3 of the remaining lords slowly drew their ceremonial blades. Mutiny. The wolf beneath Valin's skin threw its weight against its cage. How did Lord Vance get the old legal document so quickly? The realization hit him like a physical blow. A traitor was sitting in this very room, feeding the assassins exactly what they needed to bind the king's hands. Valin took one slow step toward Vance. Feral gold bled into his irises. A low rumble started deep in his chest, vibrating through the floorboards. "Are you a king or a rabid dog?" Vance choked out, stumbling backward. Valin didn't answer. He let the monster off its leash.
A black iron arrow shattered the window. Runa dove behind the heavy velvet sofa. Glass rained down onto the rugs. She ripped her dagger from its sheath and scanned the gardens outside. Nothing moved. The courtyard was completely empty. The panic spiked, then leveled out into a ringing, eerie quiet. She crept out from behind the sofa. The black shaft was embedded deep in the floorboards. A piece of rough paper was tied to the wood. Dread settled heavy and cold in her stomach. She untied the string and unfolded the note. It wasn't a threat. It was a crude charcoal drawing of a small boy missing a front tooth. Pip. A memory flashed. A freezing morning in the slums. Starving and alone, she had been sitting in the mud when little Pip handed her a stolen crust of bread. He had smiled at her when the rest of the world spat at her feet. She had sworn to keep him safe. Now, the guild had him. She looked at the bottom of the note. "We know the king's weakness. To come alone to the burning square, or the boy dies slowly." Runa stared at the charcoal drawing. If the guild knew Valin's weakness, they had a trap waiting for him too. If he tried to rescue her, he would walk straight into a slaughter. She knew what she had to do. Protect the king. Protect Pip. She walked over to the wardrobe and stripped off the warm silk of the court. She pulled her torn, dirty street leathers back on. She didn't pack her extra throwing knives. She left her heavy armor on the floor. She walked to the massive bed and placed her silver dagger exactly in the center of Valin's pillow. She didn't know what terrified her more, burning alive in the outlands tonight, or the fact that she would never feel Valin's arms around her again. Runa opened the servant doors and stepped out into the dark.
The oak door to Runa's bedroom was wide open, groaning against the cold wind. Valin shoved past the bleeding council guards in the hallway. His chest heaved. He ignored the gashes across his knuckles. He just needed to see her. He needed the grounding scent of rain and blood. He walked into a freezing, empty room. Broken glass crunched beneath his boots. The air smelled of ozone and cold despair. His eyes locked onto the bed. Her silver dagger lay perfectly still on his pillow, and next to it sat a crumpled piece of paper. Valin snatched the note. As he read the threat, his pulse flatlined. She had surrendered. The foolish, broken woman had walked straight into a lethal trap to save a street kid and protect a fractured crown. Agony tore through his chest. Because of his political games, he had failed to keep her safe. Because he played the emotionless statue, she believed she had to fight in the dark alone. He dropped to his knees. He gripped the silver dagger so tightly that the edge bit into his palm. Blood dripped down the shining steel. The thick, glacial barriers around his soul didn't just crack, they shattered. He didn't care about the ancient laws anymore. He didn't care about the council or the crown or the throne. Deep in his mind, through the blood oath binding them, he felt a sudden, sharp spike of pain. Her pain. Valen's bones snapped. Thick, dark fur ripped through his clothes. His jaw elongated into a massive snout. The king died. The beast took over. He threw his head back and let out a roar that promised an ocean of blood. The oak doors of the council chamber exploded. Wood shrapnel rained across the polished tables. Valen stepped through the dust. Thick, dark fur coated his forearms. His chest heaved. The lord scrambled backward, diving under the mahogany. Valen ignored them. He unclasped his velvet cloak and let it drop to the floor. The civilized king was dead. He stalked out into the courtyard. Rain lashed against the cobblestones. 50 elite guards stood waiting in the downpour. Valen remembered the brutal winter wars of his youth. Men didn't die for ink on a parchment. They fought for the man bleeding next to them in the mud. He couldn't order these soldiers as a monarch. He had to unleash them as a monster. The crown stays here. Valen's voice cut through the storm. The guild took my mate. March with me tonight, and you march as rogue wolves. We burn their compound to the foundation. Who stands with the beast? Silence hung in the rain for one heartbeat. Then, 50 longswords cleared their scabbards. The steel rang out in perfect unison. No hesitation. The men roared. The wind shifted. A sharp scent drifted up from the lower city. Burning pitch mixed with Runa's terrified blood. Agony ripped through Valen's chest. He had to reach the flames before they blistered her skin. He lunged into the downpour. Dropping to all fours, he let the shift completely overtake him. His men followed. A pack of predators let off their chains, rushing the outland slums.
Rust bit into her wrists. Runa hung from the damp stone wall. Her toes scraped the freezing floor, just out of reach of taking her own weight. The underground cell smelled of old blood and sour ale. The guildmaster paced in front of her. He was a massive man, with a jagged scar bisecting his blind eye. He swung a heavy spiked bat at his side. "You really thought the sovereign cared about a stray?" The master laughed. "You're a toy. He isn't leaving his safe castle for a street rat." Doubt flared in her ribs. Then her bones remembered. The ghost of Valen's hands pressing into her poisoned shoulder. The raw heat of his mouth against hers. He had claimed her. She remembered a cave-in from the deep mines years ago. Pinned under the rock for 2 days, she hadn't waited to die. She snapped her own arm to squeeze through a gap into the sunlight. She didn't know how to wait for death. And Valen was coming. He isn't going to save me. Runa lifted her chin. Blood dripped from her jaw. He's coming to completely destroy you. The guildmaster snarled. He raised the spiked bat high. Runa twisted her right hand. She jammed her wrist against the iron and forced her thumb backward. Cartilage popped. White-hot pain blinded her. She swallowed her scream, pulling her slick, bloody hand through the rusted cuff. She dropped hard, swinging her free arm. She grabbed a handful of loose dirt from the floor and threw it directly into the master's good eye. Before he could swing his weapon, the ground heaved. A massive explosion rocked the compound. The stone ceiling cracked. Dust rained down over them. The ringing adrenaline faded into a heavy, vibrating silence. The monster had arrived.
The steel vault doors buckled inward, then gave way completely. Valen hit the underground corridor. He didn't wait for his men to form a battle line. The smoky hallway was packed with assassins. Crossbows raised, swords drawn. Valen hit their ranks. He tore through boiled leather and chainmail. The tight space echoed with the wet sound of tearing flesh and snapping ribs. Hot blood sprayed across the stone walls. A spear drove deep into Valen's shoulder. He didn't break stride. He grabbed the attacker's throat and squeezed until the bone crushed. The shrieks of dying men faded. Valen stood alone in the hallway. His chest heaved, pulling in the metallic stench of the carnage. Blood dripped from his claws. The silence was absolute. Then, the mating bond flared in his mind. A sharp, white-hot spike of agony. She had just broken her own bone. Valen moved. He became a blur in the dark, tracking the scent of her sweet, terrified blood to the deepest cell. He slammed his hands into the solid iron door frame. Gripping the edges, he violently ripped the door off its hinges and threw it aside. He stepped into the cell. The scarred guildmaster stood over Runa. She was bleeding, hanging from one chain, clutching her ruined hand against her chest. The massive man was blindly raising a spiked bat toward her head. Valen locked his eyes on the man's throat. He launched himself across the room.
Dark fur slammed into the giant. Muscle crushed against whetstone. The iron bat clattered across the floor. The chain holding Runa snapped. She hit the ground hard. White-hot pain ripped up her arm from her dislocated thumb. She tasted rust and stale dirt. She scrambled to her knees. Her good hand locked around the handle of the spiked bat. Hesitation bred death in the outlands. She had to move. The guildmaster drew a short, poisoned dagger. He slashed wildly at Valen's ribs. Valen dropped low, dodging the steel, his golden eyes locked onto Runa's. No words, just perfect, lethal synchronization. Runa charged. She left her left flank entirely exposed, a fatal opening. She had to trust his speed. She hoisted the heavy iron bat high. The master lunged. The poisoned blade drove straight toward her unprotected ribs. Valen intercepted. He caught the dagger directly in his bare palm. The blade bit deep into his flesh, stopping inches from her side. He absorbed the blow. Runa had her opening. She swung the iron bat with everything she had left. The spike smashed squarely into the side of the master's skull. The giant collapsed. Dead weight hit the bloody stones. Runa dropped the weapon. The deafening crunch of bone gave way to a ringing stillness. Her lungs burned for air as the adrenaline bottomed out. Dust settled over the carnage. Total silence rushed into the cell. She stared at the massive beast in front of her. Dark fur soaked in blood, fangs dripping. First the dead assassin lay at her feet. The living monster watched her. Slowly, Valen dropped to his knees in the mud. The feral monarch bowed his massive head to a bleeding street rat. Runa took a shuddering breath. She reached out with her bloody hand and tangled her fingers deep into the dark fur at the nape of his neck.
Valen stared up at the tiny, defiant woman who had just gutted an empire for him. Mud and blood coated her battered skin, but her posture was unyielding iron. She was magnificent. Elite guards poured into the subterranean cell. Heavy torches illuminated the slaughter Valen had carved through the corridors. A young soldier stepped forward. His armor clanked against the stone. We found the street boy locked in the upper cages. He is unharmed. Valen's chest expanded. He dragged in a deep breath of smoke and char. The guild's leverage was gone. Another guard dragged a whimpering prisoner into the torchlight. He threw Lord Vance violently to the damp floorboards. You will hang from the tallest spire of the citadel. Valen's voice rolled like thunder across the bloody stones. He dismissed the traitor and the staring soldiers with a sharp turn of his shoulder. His entire focus locked back onto Runa. The wolf vibrated against his ribs. He reached her, and gently taking her dislocated hand between his large, blood-slicked palms. With a sharp, sudden twist, he popped the bone back into its socket. Runa gasped, a harsh intake of breath. But she didn't step back. She leaned forward until her forehead rested against the solid wall of his chest. Valen buried his face in the crook of her soot-stained neck. He inhaled the scent of wild rain and earth. He dragged his jaw firmly across her pulse point, marking his mate in front of his men. A soft, A trembling sigh escaped her lips. He swept her up into his arms, hoisting her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. He carried her past the terrified traitor and up the winding stone stairs, leaving the ruins behind for the open sky. "You are mine." He murmured the words against her temple. His grip tightened as they breached the surface.
Weeks burned away into a quiet, steady rhythm. The heavy stone of the citadel finally felt like a fortress instead of a cage. The suffocating cold had melted. Roaring hearths and bright sunlight warmed the polished marble floors. Runa stood alone on the grand balcony. A warm summer breeze tangled through her clean hair. The air smelled of blooming jasmine and pine. She wore a flowing dress of dark crimson silk. It pooled around her bare feet. But a silver-edged dagger remained strapped tightly to her thigh. It was no longer a shield of paranoia. It was an anchor to who she was. The king never asked her to put her steel away. Behind her, the heavy oak doors to the bedchamber clicked shut. The sound echoed with a satisfying finality. Her pulse picked up. The scent of frost and dark spice saturated the air. Valen stepped onto the balcony. He was stripped of his heavy royal furs, wearing only a loose linen shirt that revealed the thick silver scars across his chest. He closed the distance silently. Wrapping his arms around her waist, he pulled her back until her spine rested flush against his chest. "Where is your mind tonight?" His voice vibrated through her skin. She tilted her head back against his shoulder. Her lungs expanded as she absorbed the unguarded heat radiating from his frame. "I was remembering the damp cellars in the outlands." She traced the raised veins on the back of his hand. "I used to sleep with a blade in my palm, terrified of every shadow." The ash-covered memories of her past only made the solid reality of his body feel more permanent. Valen turned her gently within his grip. The ancient ice was completely gone from his golden eyes, replaced by a dark, consuming obsession, fixated entirely on her. "You never have to run again." He brushed his knuckles down the curve of her throat. "You are my gravity." She slid her hands up his broad chest. Her fingers curled deeply into his dark hair, anchoring herself to him. She dragged his mouth down to hers. The kiss tasted of sweet wine and wild, untamed devotion. A low vibration tore from his throat. His hands swept down her spine, pressing her flush against the cold marble railing with a desperate possession. "Mine." He breathed the word roughly against her lips. His thumb traced the hilt of the dagger at her thigh before he swept her entirely off her feet.